So first things first, I want to draw your attention to this, which is a map of the Electoral College. This is going to come into play very heavily here as we get closer and closer to November. Does anybody know, and throw it into the chat if you do, where you come up with these point totals, which go ahead and indicate the electoral value of each state? In other words, Texas is a 38-point state, Louisiana an 8-point state, Arkansas a 6-point state, and that's how much power these states have in presidential elections. Does anyone know where these numbers come from? I've got population coming up into the chat, and that is mostly right. So here's the way. Does anyone actually know the mathematical equation that gives these states their value? Anybody? Okay, here's why you're here. So where this number comes from is it is actually the number of senators plus the number of representatives in the House of Representatives that your state gets in Congress. So in other words, Texas has 36 members in the House of Representatives. And you're right, the two of you who volunteered that in chat, you're right in that comes from population. But the other two are actually senators, and every state gets at least 2 senators. So you can see up here, Wyoming. Wyoming is a 3-point state, right? South Dakota is a 3-point state. North Dakota is a 3-point state. Alaska is a 3-point state. What I will tell you is that most of those states are actually overvalued in terms of the significance they have in a presidential election. The goal in the Electoral College is to get to 270 points. That's whoever reaches that number first gets to go ahead and be president in November, whether that is Biden or Trump, right? Well, Wyoming has to go ahead and have 3 because it has to have at least 1 member in the House, and it has to have 2 senators. No state gets fewer than 2 senators, and no state gets fewer than 1 representative in the House. Same thing with like South Dakota, same things with North Dakota. The reason why I tell you that those states are overvalued is that what you tend to have is you tend to go ahead and have fewer proportionally population numbers required to go ahead and justify that total in North Dakota than you would have in, say, Texas. In other words, let's say that, I don't remember the exact equation, but let's say that you get 1 representative for every 150,000 people that you have in your state. Well, let's say that North Dakota has like 350,000 people in state. So it wouldn't technically go ahead and get to 3 electors in the Electoral College. What I'm telling you is that because the minimum they can have is 3, even though that is over-representative of the actual population they have, that is what they're going to get. And so, you know, I mean, on the one hand, you know, people will gripe because mathematically, again, kind of these states that are empty of population, people will gripe because they are overrepresented. But on the other hand, I mean, it's North Dakota, throw them a bone. I mean, you got to do what you got to do. So that being said, that is where those numbers come from. The reason why I bring this up is I used to start each one of my classes with kind of like a current event or a bit of trivia to help you understand what is coming up in November. And so again, when you look at these point values, I think it's fascinating because you can also see the division between red and blue. Now I'm going to throw you an easy one. What do red and blue signify in this particular 2016 Electoral College map? Someone throw it in the chat. Yeah, political parties. So red being states that voted, that threw their number value to the Republicans, and blue being states that threw their number value to the Democrats. Check out, if you would please, look at this map. Check and see what are the most electorally significant states that you see here. There are 4. See if you can find which 4 and rattle them off. You can just use the abbreviations. California, Texas, Florida, New York. Yep, that is it. California, Texas, Florida, and New York are the most significant states electorally in the election. Now you look at those states because as you can see, a Texas is worth more than 16 South Dakotas, right? I'm sorry, my math is terrible. It is worth 12 South Dakotas. So that being said, when you look at this, Texas has enormous electoral weight in the Electoral College. It will have enormous weight. It will take a candidate a significant amount of the way just by itself out of all 50 states. It will take a candidate a significant amount of the way to getting to that 270 point number. So the reason why I say that is historically, Texas, for the last 30 years, has thrown its electoral weight behind Republican candidates, hence the red color that you see here. They threw their weight in 2016 clearly behind Donald Trump. California, by contrast, one of the other most populous states, has 55 electoral points. That is ridiculous. Its next closest competitor is Texas. So you can clearly see that California will give a candidate an enormous edge. It alone takes a candidate almost a fifth of the way, just that single state, towards winning the presidential election. So that being said, California historically votes for Democrats. New York also historically votes for Democrats. And so right then you have California and New York who will throw their weight behind a candidate to the degree that they alone get a candidate almost in 2 states only, almost a third of the way to the presidency because those states are so populous. Texas will go ahead and give its value to the Republican candidate. And let's look at Florida, the 4th most populous state on this list, tied with New York anyway. Who does Florida typically give its electoral points to in a presidential election? I mean, that's almost 30 points. That's nothing to sneeze at. Who usually gets those? I got Republican in the chat. I get Republican in the chat from another person. Somebody else throw a guess out. Really, you got a 50-50 shot. Someone want to say it? Someone want to say literally the only other option? Nope, everyone's sticking with Republicans. I will tell you that I admire your commitment, but I will tell you that it is about 50-50. Who the heck knows? Florida has given its votes to both Obama and Trump. Florida has given its votes to both Bill Clinton and George Bush. Florida tends to be a swing state. So it is very hard to predict from election to election who those 30 votes are going for. Other major swing states are the ones that you would think would be major. Virginia is a swing state. Pennsylvania is a swing state. Ohio is a swing state. In other words, if it's double digit and it's near the Great Lakes, it tends to be a swing state. Florida being perhaps the exception in terms of geography, but it is definitely probably the largest of the swing states. These others, Texas, California, and New York, can be counted on to go ahead and vote the way that you would think that they would vote. Any questions on any of that? No? Makes sense going into November? Cool, cool. Okay, so let's go ahead and keep going and actually get to the content. So if you've got no other questions, I'm gonna go ahead and start where I would start with you guys on like the second day of government. Are you good with that? Yeah? Okay, here we go. All right. So here's the thing. Everybody always refers to our country as a democracy. You constantly hear like the man on the street go ahead and say like America is the greatest democracy in the world. And they're partly right, it's pretty great. And they're partly right, it's kind of a democracy. But in reality, we're not thoroughly a democracy. We are actually a constitutional republic. Remember the Pledge of Allegiance? You've said it probably the vast majority of your public school career. Think about it for a second. When you say the Pledge of Allegiance, you throw your hand over your heart and you're like, I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands. We're not technically a democracy, and here's why. In a democracy, especially a participatory democracy, which is like the purest form of democracy, every single person gets a vote on every single issue. True democracies, participatory democracies, are very rare. I mean, can you imagine every single issue that came up that people would vote on? Every environmental bill, every seatbelt regulation, every impeachment trial, every matter of personal importance, whether it be, abortion or the death penalty. In other words, the people themselves, each one of us in a participatory democracy, if that's what we were, would get to vote. We would be doing nothing but going to the polls. We would be constantly voting. That is not a practical way, even with the technology we have today, that is not a practical way to go ahead and run a country. And so ultimately our country early on in the constitutional days decided that republics or representative democracy was going to be the way to go. And so that is actually what we are. We're a constitutional republic. At best, we are like 90% republic to maybe 10% democracy. We do have occasional elements of participatory democracy in our society. There aren't many, but there is one that's notable. And I know Coach Roach and I taught this in APUSH last year, but I know it's been a long year, and I do not blame you for not remembering. But does anybody recall what referendums are? Thumbs up, thumbs down? Okay, so referendums are essentially where every once in a while, a state, and only certain states are allowed to do this, a state will actually call a vote on a topic of significance, and it will ask for the people to go ahead and vote on a topic or on an issue rather than on a person, right? If that makes sense. So in a referendum, for example, let's just go with the most infamous that has occurred in the last 10, 15 years, marijuana legalization, right? Some states have wanted to opt for marijuana legalization. Like that is a thing that they have pursued, right? Significant portions of the population have wanted to legalize weed. I'm not going to question their motives. Let's just say that this is a thing they want, okay? Well, long story short, no representative was ever going to go to the state house and basically advocate for the legalization of marijuana, especially not in like the 90s when these movements were starting to take shape. They would have been like laughed out of the room, right? It was an even more conservative time than the time that we live in now. And so no representative was gonna risk his career, his reputation, going to a legislature and saying like, let's legalize weed. Nobody that anybody took seriously, right? But the populations of several states like Colorado, right? Like California, like Nevada, like Oregon, they wanted this, like Washington State. They wanted weed legalization. The people did, but their representative was not actually going to represent them in this pursuit. So ultimately what happens is that instead, the people of the state just chose to go around their representative. They're like, screw it. If the representative isn't actually going to represent our wishes, then we will simply step to the side of them and bypass them and basically go behind their back, and we will make it happen themselves. That is called a referendum. So instead, on a ballot that year, the ballot, let's say that they got enough signatures on the petition and they got weed legalization on the ballot, right? What they would do is they would go ahead and have like on the ballot that year, they'd have like their typical vote for who's going to represent them in Congress, who's going to be the new judge, who's going to be the new railroad commissioner, yada, yada, right? And it would be like, railroad commissioner, Bob or Sally, like lieutenant governor, Drew or Kathy. And then it'd be like weed, yes or no, right? And so like ultimately what would happen is when you have a referendum, you are voting for an issue, not a person. And it just so happened that a lot of states over the last 20 years, really over the last 10 years, have gone ahead and voted yes once they've gotten that referendum on the ballot. And that is why marijuana has been legalized in multiple states, because they couldn't count on the representative to do it for them. So they simply used referendums to go around their back. Now, not every state can go ahead and utilize referendums. Certain states actually have it in their constitutions. Certain states actually have it in their body of laws that we can use referendums. Certain cannot. Thumbs up for yes, thumbs down for no. Do you think Texas allows its citizens to go ahead and launch referendums, not just on weed, but on any topic? Do you think Texas will allow its citizens to put items on the ballot? You are correct. Texas does not. Referendums, the ability to use referendums, actually came around in the Gilded Age when people were getting sick of the way legislators were basically screwing them over. Legislators only, if you'll recall, answered to like the railroad barons, the robber barons and such. And so people are like, fine, we will simply go around. In several states, especially kind of the more liberal ones, would go ahead and allow for referendums to be created. So again, your Washington states, your Colorados, your Oregons, your Californias, all those states allow Massachusetts, all those states allow referendums. But a lot of the blue states that you saw on that map, right? Those are referendum states. A lot of the red states have actually said, no, we have representatives for a reason. And we don't need kind of these fringe movements getting things onto the ballot that don't go through like the normal channels, if you're hearing me say that. Does that make sense? Okay, cool. So that is, let me show you the chart again, because that's really, when you're talking about types of democracy, that is really the only way that participatory democracy exists in the United States. Referendums are really the only form of that we have. In every other way, we are a republic. Let me go to talk to you about a couple other evolutions of the idea of democracy. Participatory is, again, the purest form, where individuals are allowed to decide issues for themselves. Okay, so then what's pluralistic democracy? Okay, so when you use the word plural, you think about groups, right? So plural would be the opposite of singular. Pluralistic democracy is when you have tight-knit groups that go ahead and control a vote rather than individuals. So in other words, pluralistic democracy would be like, think of like special interest groups that you have today. Let's name both a conservative one and a liberal one. Like, so the NRA, right, the National Rifle Association, that would be a solid conservative group that goes ahead and tries to control the outcome of votes. That's just a thing they do. All of these groups do it. Now, the National Organization of Women, right, dating back to like the 1960s, that would be a more liberal pluralistic group, right? They try to swing votes their way. And so ultimately, these groups, I will tell you, wield probably disproportionate amounts of power. If you have a 5,000 person group, right, it usually in the way American policy works, because they're organized and they're well funded and frankly, they're loud. Have you ever seen the Facebook mom groups? Whenever you get like certain groups of people together and they have a lot of pull and they have a lot of power and they can make a lot of noise, these groups wield more power than a group of 5,000 people actually should. And this is, again, called pluralistic democracy. And when I'm talking about groups like the NRA and the NAACP and the AARP, and you've probably heard these groups before, these groups have far more power than their membership would suggest, because they know who to talk to. They know who to go ahead and what campaigns to spend money on. They know how to organize an email drive. They don't go to like change.org. No, they're far more sophisticated than that, right? And so therefore they're able to like leverage their will in a way that an individual cannot. I like, as an individual, I will never be able to compete with like the AARP, right? Like I will never be able to go ahead and use my, like, it doesn't matter if they're like, say the ARP, I can't remember how many members they have. I know it's a lot. Let's say the ARP has like, 50 million members, right? I will never, even if there were 50 million of me scattered throughout the country, we would never have the ability to move policy the way the AARP does, because it does it in an organized, coordinated, very like aggressive fashion. And if you don't believe me, I've got a quick story. So my granny is still alive and she's like 97, right? Every time I go to her mailbox, like every time, and I check her mail for her, she lives in an assisted living facility, I'll like open it up and there is like a stack of mail, right? Because she never checks it. I don't know what else she's doing with her day, but she never checks her mail. And so I check it, and like in it, there are always, if there are 10 letters, there are always like 4 of them that are from the ARP, because they're like telling her how to vote. And they're telling her like what candidates support her interests and what candidates support Social Security. Like they're organized and they're effective in that way at going ahead and getting her attention. And so in 2018, when we had the congressional election in November, I talked to her and I was like, yeah, Granny, like, I voted today. And she was like, did you really? That's so great. Go America. I'm like, yeah, did you go vote, Granny? And I thought like the answer would be no, right? Because they don't really like let her out. And she was like, yes, I voted today. I'm like, okay, like, because sometimes Granny imagines things. And I'm like, no, really? Like you did? And she's like, yes, I voted today. It was very nice. And I'm like, how did you, like, no offense, but like, how'd you get out? And she's like, they drove a bus and they picked us up and they took us to the voting booth. And I'm like, really? Who drove the bus? Already imagining that I knew the answer to this question. And she's like, the AARP, the American Association of Retired Persons, drove over and picked up Granny and probably 40, 50 other inmates, if that's what you want to call them, and went ahead and drove them to the polls. And I have no doubt that there was a guy on the speaker at the front of the bus the entire drive, basically saying, okay, this person votes for this, you should support this person no. And I'm like, yeah, all right, Granny, that makes sense. I totally get that is exactly what occurred. So again, that form of democracy is called pluralistic democracy. And then lastly, there's my least favorite, and that is called elite democracy. Elite democracy is essentially the idea that the wealthiest, elite democracy is essentially the idea that the very wealthiest people in society, the people who wield the most influence, the most power, right? Your Jeff Bezos, your Bill Gates. These are the people who are able to move policy in the most effective way. And honestly, I will tell you that this right here, participatory democracy, that would probably be like the ideal form, as I told you, like the purest form of democracy. I think America these days is probably about here. And I think we are dangerously close to tipping into this, where you start having the absolute wealthiest. Because if these people wield influence, I can actually understand that. You know, if you have 5,000 people and you can get them organized, then sure, maybe they do get to go ahead and wield that influence. But this is what I do not like. Whereas, you know, I mentioned that I will never be able to compete with the AARP. I sure as heck will never be able to compete with Jeff Bezos. But yet I am one person living in this country, and he is one person living in this country. And so in theory, if we take democracy down to its like finest principles, in theory, we should be the same. But let me zoom on my face for emphasis. We're not the same, okay? Jeff Bezos and I are not the same in terms of the amount of influence we wield, nor will we ever be. So that is what it is. Okay. Let me go ahead and finish this up, and then I'll leave it open to questions, and we'll move on from there. So Jefferson basically, so let me actually jump back in time real quickly, back to the American Revolution and where this all started, like this whole foundation for what we have. One of the documents you have to know for AP government is the Declaration of Independence. You actually have to know 9 documents. I'll send you a list before these tutorials are over. But basically you have to know 9 documents, and one of them is the Declaration of Independence. I do not want to confuse you. All the Declaration of Independence is it is a list of grievances and a list of problems that we had with England, which caused us to declare independence. It is literally the thing that it sounds like. It is us declaring independence from England. What is it based around? Well, I will tell you that Thomas Jefferson was not totally original as a person. He actually went ahead and ripped off quite a few of his ideas from other Enlightenment thinkers, particularly John Locke, Rousseau, and particularly those two, frankly. And what he did, if you've heard of those guys from WAP, and I know it's been a while, or if you took Euro, you probably heard about them as well. But John Locke in particular was Jefferson's go-to guy. And what he basically took from John Locke was the idea of consent of the governed. And basically, what Jefferson said was, when he was declaring independence from England, he basically told King George III, he said, look, you have governed us terribly. You have taxed us without representation. You have gone ahead and thrown our citizens into jail without jury trials. You've taken control of our trade. You've blockaded our ports. You've quartered troops in our houses, all these things, right? If you remember Apush et al., like all of these things. And so he said, well, you have screwed us over again and again. And he gave like half the Declaration of Independence is just a bulleted list of ways that they wronged us, right? And he's like, we no longer consent. We no longer want to be governed by you. And when people no longer wish to be governed by the people who are governing them, they have a right to declare independence. And he basically lifted that idea straight from John Locke and Rousseau. And basically the idea is that we have a social contract with our government. Like we, the people, we have a social contract with our government. In other words, we give up a little bit of our natural rights in order to get the protection of the rest of those natural rights. In other words, we concede, we go ahead and relinquish a little bit of, for instance, our property. We pay taxes, right? A little bit of our freedom. We have laws that we have to obey. We will give up a few things in order to ensure that we have a government that protects us from invading armies, governments that educate us, government that builds infrastructure. In other words, we'll give up some stuff. In return, you better fulfill your obligation. And what Jefferson said is, when you do not uphold your end of the contract, this social contract, we don't have to uphold ours either. We will simply remove ourselves from this relationship. It's a breakup letter. We will essentially remove ourselves from this relationship, and that will be the end of that. Now, here's the catch. Give me a second. Once you remove yourself, and we did, there's a problem, because you have to go ahead and ask yourselves, what comes next? And so the founding fathers sort of scrambled, and I'm sure you've heard this story before, so I will keep it brief. They're like, yay, we're free, yay, we're free, we're free, yay. Oh, but who's in charge now? Because once you throw off your monarchy, once you throw off authoritarianism, somebody has to take over. And so they tossed together probably the extreme opposite of an authoritarian government, which is the Articles of Confederation. It was, think of it like a rough draft of the governments to come, but basically what it was a government that if tyranny and monarchy were too strict, this government goes too far in the other direction. It's chaos. It's basically far, far, far too loosey-goosey lenient. And so ultimately, they throw together this document called the Articles of Confederation, which I'm going to have you look at later. And the Articles of Confederation is the second of the 9 documents you need to know for this course. And basically what you have to understand about it is it treated the United States of America as essentially 13 separate countries as opposed to 1 separate country. In other words, we were a loose confederation of states, right? Like we actually, instead of, hold on. In fact, actually, I used to show my A-Push kids this. Sorry. There it is. So whenever you're taught grammar in school, you're always taught the United States. Okay, so go into chat. What is the actual verb that is appropriate in that sentence? The United States is a great country, or the United States are a great country? Is, yeah. I mean, that is actually correct. Nowadays, that is actually the verb we would use. We would say the United States is a great country. Well, what I will tell you is that verb is relatively new. When the United States was originally formed, they would actually use the verb are. The United States are a great country, because they would actually think of themselves as like a loose friendship of Massachusetts and Rhode Island and South Carolina and Georgia and Pennsylvania. And when I use the word loose friendship, sometimes I mean so loose it's almost like antagonistic. Like some of these states just truly did not like one another. And so it's this very loose confederation. In fact, confederation actually refers to a friendship. It's this very loose association of states that frankly just did not like one another very much and didn't trust one another, and did not think of themselves as partners for the good of like a single US of America. So that being said, it was extremely decentralized. And so they're like, okay, we can't do that. We can't remain decentralized, because essentially it was causing all sorts of problems. Certain states had debts to other countries that certain states did not. There were different currencies for different states. There were like Rhode Island dollars and Georgia dollars and Massachusetts dollars, and you couldn't always spend those dollars in the state. You couldn't like always transfer those dollars to the state and spend them there. There was essentially no army, because states could not be convinced to pay the taxes to support one. There was no single governing figure. In other words, there was not a president who had any sort of authority whatsoever. The Articles of Confederation, you could tell where it was coming from. It was coming from a place of fear. They threw this garbage together because they were worried about tyranny. Well, like I said, they didn't have tyranny anymore, but what they had was chaos. And so for almost a decade, they lived under this chaos and tried to go ahead and make it work. And ultimately, there was a rebellion called Shays' Rebellion, where a bunch of farmers are like, we're not paying these taxes. And they rose up and they were going to like march to go start burning down cities. And ultimately, the founding fathers scrambled, because they realized that just as they had gone ahead and been the revolters, they had been the rebels, they had been the ones throwing off tyranny. If there was another revolution, it was going to be their heads in a basket. And so they're like, no, we hear you farmers. We have decided that, yes, you were right. This government that we have is no good. The problem was the Articles of Confederation were extremely difficult to amend, right? Actually, in order to amend it, you actually, I think, had to have 13 of the 13 states agree to an amendment. So they're like, forget it. We simply won't amend it. It is not worthwhile. We will simply throw it out. And so ultimately what they do as they decide they're just going to trash this thing. And so they rip it to pieces. They go to Philadelphia at a constitutional convention, and they decide they are going to write a new document, which is not too lenient, like the Articles, not too strong like tyranny, and they are going to name it the Constitution. And I will sell you on this point. If you hear me say nothing else, hear me say this. The Constitution is a product of political brilliance. Like, I have criticisms of America, and I'm sure you do too. And there are things that we have done wrong, and there are things that we have done right. The Constitution is unbelievably well thought through and unbelievably well put together. Nobody thought we would last as a new country. Nobody thought we would last. Europeans, knobs would, thumb their nose at us and turn away. They thought we would be gone in a decade, and we almost were, until we crafted this thing that allowed us to essentially become an American experiment that was like largely successful. And part of the reason for that is that we have never in American history had like a building where we had like greater political minds assembled. It was just serendipity, right? It was just good fortune. It was a miracle that we had Ben Franklin and Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, right? And George Washington. And then the new guy who kind of wanders in, who like nobody had paid attention to previously, and no drama nerds. I'm not talking about Alexander Hamilton. He was actually kind of a prat at this thing. I am actually talking about James Madison. James Madison wanders in, and he is able to take all of this theory, the ideas of the Enlightenment, and actually craft it into a functional document, which has sustained us for about 250 years, against all odds. And so that is, I love the Constitution, clearly. I'm sitting here talking about it for free. And I hope that if it's not me, then I hope whoever your next teacher is can impart some of that love to you, so that you understand it well and learn to treasure it as I have. So that being said, that is the end of the evening. I will do another one of these when it gets to lesson 2, and we will go from there. I did tell you I would show you this real quickly, and I will. Let me jump to it. Sorry. Nope, not that. Nope, 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 nope. Ah, there it is. I will tell you that if you do choose to take the AP test, one of the questions, probably about 25% of the exam, is actually telling you to use one of the 9 documents that you have to know. So in class tomorrow, your teacher may or may not show you this, whether or not I can get it to them, but I need you, or I don't need you to do anything, I'm done. But you may want, of your own free will, to go ahead and Google the actual text, or the actual text, I'm sorry, of the Declaration of Independence and the actual text of a document called Brutus No. 1. I've left them on your screen so you can see if you want to go and take a screenshot, and actually look for those, because those will help you understand 2 of the 9 documents that you will have to know this year in a little bit more detail. You won't have to have these things memorized by any stretch of the imagination, but you will have to understand the main idea in a way that will be sufficient for you to actually craft a DBQ-based argument around it. So look at those, take care of that. If you would like to go ahead and enhance your knowledge on these things, I'm going to go ahead and hit, hold on. I'm going to stop the recording.